All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Academia and PhD webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew. I'm the Associate Director of the Milken Scholars Program, and I'll be introducing our four panelists for today's webinar. Each of the panelists will speak for around 6 minutes, and then we'll open it to Q&A. So my advice for anyone who's watching would be to write down any questions you may think of. Without any further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists. So we've got Kathleen Gutierrez, who is a 2006 Los Angeles Alumni Scholar. Kat, why don't you say hi for the camera?
Hi, everyone.
So Kat graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with degrees in public health and Southeast Asian studies. She's currently pursuing a PhD in Southeast Asian studies through UC Berkeley, and her dissertation project involves a history of Philippine botany. She was awarded dissertation research fellowships by the Social Science Research Council and the U.S. Department of Education Fulbright Hays program. Kat will discuss the PhD application process and productivity strategies. We also have Eric Shirokoff, who is a 1998 Los Angeles Alumni Scholar who graduated from UC Berkeley with a BA in astrophysics and physics and a PhD in physics. And Eric, you want to say hi for the camera?
Hi, everyone.
So Eric is a professional astronomer whose work focuses on developing cryogenic detectors for the cosmic microwave background and a high redshift universe. He's a senior member at the Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics and an assistant professor in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Chicago. Eric will discuss tenure track positions, working at national labs, teaching as a profession, and teaching institutions. Third, we have Helaine Blumenthal, who is a 1999 New York Alumni Scholar. Helaine, would you like to say hi for the camera?
Hi.
So Helaine received her BA in history from Swarthmore and her PhD in history from UC Berkeley. She currently works as the classroom program manager at the Wiki Education Foundation in San Francisco. She'll discuss transitioning into the professional world from a PhD program, motivations for getting a PhD, and how those motivations can change over time. And last but not least, we've got Joelle Corbo, who is a 2000 New York Alumni Scholar. And Joelle, can you say hi for the camera?
Hi, everyone.
So Joelle received his BS in physics from MIT and his MA and PhD in physics from UC Berkeley. As a member of the Whaley group at Berkeley, he studied ultra-cold atomic gases using quantum Monte Carlo simulation techniques. Joelle is now a senior research associate in the Center for STEM Learning at the University of Colorado Boulder, where his research focuses on improving undergraduate education in STEM departments and on researching issues of equity and inclusion in physics. Joelle will discuss the postdoc process. So with that, why don't we turn it over to our first panelist, Kathleen Gutierrez.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Andrew. I will open up by saying that I'll talk about the application to the PhD programs, but graduate programs are very different. These tend to differ based on your discipline and whether or not you're in a professional program like an MBA or an MPH. And hopefully there'll be some overlap among these programs that you can glean from. I will say that the early preparation phase should start very early. So if your applications are due by the fall, I would start as early as January. Some of my colleagues might even say earlier than that. Part of this is because test preparation is important. I, for instance, decided to take a GRE prep course. I was in the professional field for several years before I decided to go back into a PhD program. I forgot how to do math. So I highly recommend considering a test prep course just so that you can get your ducks in a row, especially if you need some support with the test taking process. And this also gives you time to research programs, specifically on who you want to work with and what specialties are out there that best fit your research needs. So well before the application process begins, I would like you to get a feel for the faculty. So look through web pages, look through department profiles, and get a feel for the students and the scholars that your department of interest is churning out. So for instance, what are the PhD students studying? What's hot, in that field or in that department? even what kind of dissertations are getting published in the last couple of years, or even research articles. And all of this will give you a sense of the priorities of that department. And of course, if it's available to you, campus visits and interviews with faculty tend to be very, very helpful. I know a lot of us are working and very, very busy, and campus visits can be financially inaccessible. So at that way, in that sense, consider talking to lecturers and graduate students. In my recent experience, I found that graduate students tend to be very available to talk about their departments. Lecturers as well. Tenure track faculty might be harder to reach, but if you are interested in working with a tenure track faculty member, which is usually the case for PhD applications, really do try reaching out to them, especially if you haven't met before and don't have a professional working relationship. Of course, during the actual application phase, there are a lot of things to kind of get underway. Most of all, it's the statements, right? And you have to tailor them well. I can't say how many times readers can really often tell when their school has been copy-pasted into an application. And from PhD applications to MBA applications, and even those for professional fields, it's usually very obvious when someone is not tailoring their statement to meet the objectives, the aims, or even the research interests of their specific department. So really, if you go into your application, specify why you want to be at an institution or in a department. Think about the courses, the faculty, the newly minted dissertations, like I mentioned earlier. What sorts of monographs are getting published out of your institution of interest? The libraries that are there, especially if you're going into the social sciences or the humanities, and any specific research initiatives that are happening campus-wide. When it comes to recommendation letters, I was told in my field that tenure track faculty, meaning getting a recommendation letter from an assistant professor, an associate professor, full professor, is the way to go, for sure. This could be different, again, depending on the field. It would be important to have an employer write a letter of recommendation for you, especially if you've been outside of academia for some number of years. And also, at the end of the day, just make sure your recommender likes you. I've heard time and again from people who are consulting about the application process. Oftentimes, the best recommenders are the one that actually liked the applicant enough to really recommend them on a personal level to whatever program they're applying to. If you are applying to a PhD program, do consider applying to more than one so that you could eventually parlay financial packages. So this was a mistake that I made. I had my eyes set on Berkeley, and I only applied to Berkeley. And when I had to kind of decide, I knew I wanted to only go to Berkeley, but this didn't come off as very serious for my department, who I think thought that I had applied to other places, and I would have maybe seemed like a stronger applicant, and I could have negotiated my financial package, meaning I could have gotten maybe more financial aid, could have increased my stipend, had I said that I got into somewhere else and now I'm deciding between two, maybe even three places. Maybe other scholars can chime in on that. And of course, the statement process alone can be beastly, so I'm really, really eager to help anyone who's trying to pull together their statements. And so anytime, even after this webinar, if you're interested, please feel free to contact me. It's something that I actually very much enjoy. And so as people work through their statements, I'm more than happy to help kind of craft something that people are proud of. And finally, when you get into the PhD program, I'm just going to reserve the last minute for this section. There are ways and strategies to survive. The PhD program does feel incredibly different. I mean, graduate school feels incredibly different from the working environment, but I think there are mindsets and strategies for succeeding quite well, especially in those first few years. And so out the gate, I would just say, don't read everything. If you're in a social science program or a humanities program, you might be reading 2-3 books a week, and you really don't have to read 2 to 3 books a week. You'll figure out, I think, the best ways to synthesize literature, and it doesn't mean having to go line by line. And you have to test the workflow strategies that work best for you. So whether it's software that helps you get organized, software that helps you word process, all these are going to look a little bit different, and thankfully there are several blogs out there that can guide you on what you think would be best to help make sure you're getting your work done on time. And it's not going to be pretty. It might not be easy and clear cut even within the first year, but don't get intimidated as you figure out strategies that work best, and build those cadre of mentors along the way. For some of us, our programs take about 8 to 10 years. So building mentors is a long, long process, but these are the people that will write your letter of recommendations eventually, who might serve on your committees when you go up for your exams, your dissertation defense, or even your capstone projects. And so do consider the ways that you're building relationships and making sure that they're fortified so that you have people that are going to champion your work later on in your program. I'm going to end there, and I will kind of allow Q&A to circle back in case there are any other questions about productivity. I'm sure there are many that our fellow scholars can chime in on. And now I'm going to hand it off to Helaine.
Oh, okay. I thought, was I next? I thought it was somebody else. That's fine. I'm happy to go now, though.
Or Eric.
Was it? No, it's totally fine. No, I thought I was third. That's completely fine. I'm happy to go. Okay. Hi again. Thank you, Andrew, for the introductions. Happy to be here with you guys. So I'm going to talk to you kind of actually. Kat covered entering academia. I am now going to talk about leaving academia. So you guys can get at the opposite ends of the spectrum here. So I'm going to talk to you about this because that's exactly what I did. So I received my PhD in history, in modern European history from Berkeley in 2012, and I decided to not pursue an academic career. So I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about the challenges of transitioning from academia into the quote-unquote professional world. What are also some of the advantages of that? And then I think what I'm going to touch on at the end, because it actually is fairly well tied into what I'm talking about, is thinking about your motivations for why you're doing a PhD, because that's ultimately, I think, going to affect whether you pursue an academic career or not. And just as a caveat, I think kind of what Kat was saying, that the application process can look very different depending on the field that you're in. So can the transition out of academia look very different? So for example, if you do a PhD in computer science or electrical engineering, for many of those fields, there's already a pretty well-established path into the professional world, where when you are a historian and decide that you do not want to be a professional historian, there isn't exactly a straightforward path to follow. So I'm going to talk about my experience is more of that, of kind of finding your footing, finding your way when moving out of academia. But I hope there's some relevance for kind of all fields. So I think when you're transitioning out of academia, one of the most challenging things, as I said, is, well, what am I going to do? Okay, there aren't too many roles for, historians or, literature scholars, like in the professional world. So you first have to, do a lot of soul searching and a lot of research about, well, what it is that you want to do. And so the first thing that I did that actually was one of the biggest helps was networking and learning how to network. It's not something they exactly focus on in the PhD, in the history PhD program. So what I really tried to do was look at my network, my LinkedIn network, my alumni network, and try to find people either who had transitioned out of academia themselves to kind of see what their path was. And then also anybody who had kind of a job that looked interesting to me, I reached out to them. And I just had, I don't even remember, probably a good 10, 15 conversations with people in various fields. And this wasn't even to get a job, or, although, if there was job opportunities that came up, great. But this really was to learn, what are people doing? How did they get there? And again, if they had transitioned out of academia, specifically, what did their path look like? What were challenges that they faced? And that was a huge help for me in particular in kind of learning what were the types of things that I wanted, to do. So I think that's a great way to begin. Once you're actually applying for jobs outside of academia, I think one of the next challenges is learning how to parlay your academic background into the professional world. So how to present yourself. And a couple of key things to keep in mind are working on your resume, right? Because now that you're in the professional world, you're not going to be presenting a CV, you're going to be submitting a resume when you apply to jobs. And so you have to remember that you don't, most employers are not going to want to see your your list of publications and all the conferences you attended and the fellowships you've received. They're interested in your skill set. And so that's where that parlaying your experience comes into play, because I think one of the hardest challenges is my PhD took 7 years. I wasn't doing nothing for those 7 years. I was doing a lot for those 7 years. But how do I show to an employer what I was doing and the skills that I learned? And ultimately, what I learned is that it's completely fair to list your doctoral program as a job, because in many ways it was. And the skills that you learned from, while doing that, writing, research, presentation, etc. So learning how to kind of really translate those academic skills into what look like, the kind of skills that you would see in a resume, it's challenging, but it's kind of what you have to, part of the process of transitioning out of academia. And then I think, the other sort of challenging part is, you do all this, you get your job, and then this is actually something that was a big surprise to me, but was actually kind of moving a little bit out of that academic mindset into that more professional environment. So, having to deal with things like quarterly goals, and I can't just do my research forever, and with no deadlines or dates or things like that. So anyway, shifting your mindset, and learning to kind of think more organizationally, more professionally, is something that really important to keep in mind. I didn't get to the motivation stuff here, so I think maybe I'll address that in the Q&A section. All right. I actually don't remember who's next. Eric or Joel?
Yeah, we're going to go to Eric now.
Okay.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, so as someone who was formerly a chief steward for a grad student union, I think calling graduate school a job is totally appropriate. Great idea. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about the tenure track faculty and National Labs career path. And I guess to give you a little background about me, so I was a grad student was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, went to another university for 1 year in graduate school and decided I didn't like the program and dropped out and switched back to UC Berkeley. And then did 8.5 years as a physics PhD student there, and had a wonderful time. Was a great experience. Then did a postdoc, and then astonishingly got hired on a tenure track faculty job. So I've been here at University of Chicago for a little over 4 years, which is a fairly selective R1 university, which is slang in the business for a large research institution with a large number of grad students. So I guess to start out, I'll give you the bad news that everybody already knows, which is that there are no jobs in academia. So during my career, I'm expected to train roughly 30 graduate students. And our department hasn't grown since 1970. So that means you have a 1 in 30 chance out of the gate of getting my job. So I realize this is like someone who's won the lottery telling you it's silly to play the lottery. I don't think that's actually true, because grad school can be a really rewarding experience. But if your only reason to go to grad school is that you want to become a professor at a research university, that's a really bad idea, because it doesn't happen for most people. In fact, it didn't happen for most of my colleagues, including people who were much more qualified and much smarter than me. So I think this has been said everywhere for the last 25 years. There's no reason this should be surprising, but a tenure track job in academia is an incredibly rare thing to get, even for people who have every possible advantage and privilege. So that's the warning. What else is bad? So I'll start by listing the bad things about this job. What else is bad? One is lost wages. So if you were to take a professional job instead of going into grad school, you would have something like 7 or 8 years of wages and experience under your belt by the time you would have graduated from grad school. So you're giving up quite a lot, even if you're in a fully funded program. And I would argue if you're not in a fully funded program, you should think carefully about whether it's a good idea. But even so, there's a lot that you're giving up by going into grad school. Other bad things, working hours are intense. There's an old joke that academia is great because it has flexible working hours. You can work any 90 hours a week that you want, which sadly is about true. The fact that I'm in my office on a Sunday evening is not a coincidence. Finally, there's a complete lack of geographic freedom. So in my subfield, the list of job openings has about 20 openings a year, and 80% of them are at land-grant universities in the middle of nowhere. There are a few that are in lovely places, but if you really want to live in the city or region that you want to live in, it's a terrible career choice. My wife is also an academic. She studies art history in ancient Mexico. And at the moment, we're living 600 miles apart, and we will be for the next 6 or 7 years, probably. It's okay. I'm happy with that, but it's not unusual. A lot of my colleagues are in the same position. So there's a lot that you're giving up by trying to chase after this career course. Finally, the last bad thing is that a significant part of your job will be finding funding for yourself and your group and your graduate students. I spend probably 40% of my time writing grant proposals in order to feed my grad students, which is not a whole lot of fun. It's the kind of administrative work that I never wanted to do. I was always very much a tweezers and soldering irons, hands-on kind of person. So I love the time I spend in the lab, but a lot of the job is actually not that much fun. Okay, so that's the warning. That's the stay away, dragons be here kind of approach. What are the good things? So the truth is, I love my job. If I won the lottery tomorrow, I would still come into work every day. I have the best colleagues in the world. I get to hang out with some of the smartest and most thoughtful people I've ever met, which is worth a lot. There's no one in my department that I haven't learned something from. And that's rare, and that's worth quite a bit. Other good things, I essentially have no boss. So I come up with what I think is a good idea, and I convince someone to pay me to pursue it, and then I get to do it. There's really nobody who can ever tell me not to do something, which is worth a lot, and is pretty interesting. So I guess the take-home message I would have is that if the only reason you're going to grad school is to get a tenure track job, you should really think carefully about whether that's a good idea. But if you enjoy grad school, and if the idea of spending 7 or 8 years thinking about cool things with cool people and pursuing something you're passionate about is appealing, and if a tenure track job seems like it could be fun, that's not a bad way to spend your time. Frankly, if I had not gotten my job, which was the most likely outcome, I would not regret having gone to grad school. I think it was one of the most productive and interesting times in my life, and I was very happy about it. Now that said, I'm in a field where there are many professional options that don't involve academia. There's a great amount of overlap with engineering, big data, et cetera. So there are plenty of options for people who decide not to continue into the academic field after grad school. So what are those options? So one option, of course, is to go into a more teaching-focused institution. So like most of us who are graduate students, I went to grad school at an R1, at a big research university. I managed to win the lottery and get a job at such a place. But the truth is there are a lot of institutions that do a fantastic job at teaching, but aren't research universities. And the focus in those institutions is somewhat different. If you want to apply to those kinds of jobs, it's important to get some real teaching experience and to write something meaningful in the teaching portion of your job application. But that can be a pretty nice life and has, in some sense, a lot more geographic freedom, especially if you're willing to think about community colleges or smaller institutions. There's actually quite a number of possibilities to find employment in those kinds of institutions, which a lot of us forget about since we're surrounded by people who are working at a research university. And then I guess finally, the other thing I would say is there are other academic-like careers that people can pursue that aren't specific to universities. So in my field, that's national labs. So that's NASA, NASA affiliates like JPL, Department of Energy Labs, NIST. And all in all, they employ more PhDs than the top 20 universities you've heard of. So there's actually quite a significant career path going into what essentially is civil service. Whether or not you're actually a government employee or a contractor is a complicated question. But there's a lot of research that actually happens in institutions that aren't universities, but have the same feel and the same kind of environment as a university. Having watched my wife's progression in her field, art history, the equivalent would be museums. And so there are lots of people who actually work in curatorial jobs or other museum-related jobs that have essentially the same environment as academia, but without the teaching requirements. So I think there are other options, even if the thing you love is academia. There are other options that feel very much the same, but don't necessarily require that you win the lottery in terms of a job search. I think I'll leave it there, and I think we're turning it over to Joelle probably next.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I guess in part what I'll talk about is the postdoc route, but I think I also, given what everybody else has talked about so far, want to circle back to a little bit about these questions of motivation for going to grad school, and also to talk a little bit about, like, at least my personal experience of grad school itself, because we sort of talked about like getting in and leaving, but not like the thing itself very much. So I think I'll fill in some of that. Of course, this is going to be sort of my personal take on it. So yeah, I very much agree with Helaine's points in particular about like thinking about your motivation for grad school, and Eric's too, right? Like why is it that you're going into this whole thing? So for me, so one big thing, I'm first generation in my family to go to college. So I certainly didn't have anybody who was a doctor in my family, this kind of doctor anyway, or the other kind for that matter. And so, you know, for me, as I was thinking about leaving undergrad, I just sort of was like, oh, well, PhD is just the next thing you do. Like, I just sort of didn't think about other options. It was just sort of felt like a very much a default to me. Like it's the next school. I should do the next school because school is what I do. And I also had this sense of like, I want to be a scientist. And so you have to just go get a PhD. But I had no real sense of what it would be like to be a grad student, what like that culture is, what academia was really about. And so there was a real way in which I didn't know what I was getting into. I wasn't really making a choice that was informed by anything in particular. And I also didn't sort of ever consider other possibilities. So in that sense, I also wasn't really making a choice. And so, you know, when I finally did get to grad school, it was a real struggle. I think that, you know, I was in grad school 9.5 years, so it sounds like basically the same amount of time as Eric, if you also include that year at a different institution. But I think our experiences were really different, because, you know, for me, it was actually pretty awful most of the time. You know, I think because I didn't really know what to expect, how to be a grad student, sort of how to interpret, how to deal with my classes, how to engage in research, how to do all sorts of things that were important to be successful. Like I really started to feel a lot of this sense of being an imposter, like I shouldn't have really been there. And things just sort of went downhill really fast for me in terms of mental health sort of issues, which, you know, would ties to maybe points that Kat didn't quite get a chance to get to, but we can talk about later in terms of like how to support yourself sort of in being productive in grad school. I mean, for me, it was one big thing was when I finally was like, oh, it is actually not a bad thing to go to therapy and find, you know, go to these resources that are available on the campus for that sort of thing. So yeah, a big piece of that was also that I ended up feeling a pretty big sense of alienation towards this R1 culture that Eric was sort of talking about, this sort of sense of like, there is a particular set of things that are valued and a particular way that things are done in institutions that are very research focused. I just did not feel like I did not feel like I fit into that. I still don't. In particular, there's pieces of that sort of way of being that felt very hyper individualistic to me, whereas I don't tend to operate well that way. There are pieces of that culture that felt hyper competitive, which maybe ties to individualism, also something that doesn't sit well with me. I was starting to develop an identity as a teacher, which seemed to also be at odds with an identity as a researcher, at least in that context. I don't think it inherently has to be. In fact, I think that they should complement each other. But often they are seen as being at odds. So there were all sorts of ways in which that experience was not so great for me. I had 3 like advisors by the time I was done in grad school. So I was on 3 different projects, and the first 2 were kind of toxic in different ways. The third one finally was a person that I ended up working well with and got my PhD. So, you know, that was an interesting process. I think that for me, a big piece that helped me through was actually finding a community of peers where we were all sort of feeling similar things and we could mutually support each other. And maybe it's not surprising that my transition out of this was like, bye physics. Like, I am not going to stay in this field that I still love as a field, but I just was like, I can't do this anymore. And so as Andrew talked about sort of in my when he sort of gave my introduction, these days I do research around STEM education, STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math, for those who haven't heard the acronym. And in particular, a lot of my work is around how to support cultural change in academia to improve education. Maybe it's not surprising that that's what I'm focusing on. Yeah, so that was a transition I decided to make as I left grad school, and a big piece of that was me trying, of what allowed me to do that was this networking piece that Helaine was talking about, like really trying to find people in that space, in that sort of academic community that I could connect to and start to learn from, and ultimately figure out who's hiring postdoctoral positions and how I could make that transition. Yeah, and that was sort of how I transitioned into the next phase, which I'm still sort of in. I think I'm out of time, so I may stop there, and then we'll see what we circle back to on questions.
All right, thank you so much for the four of you. We're going to now go to a few questions. So I'll ask some questions, and at a certain point, even our panelists can feel free to ask each other some questions. So for my first question, this one is for Kat. And Kat, you had briefly alluded to this during your presentation when you were talking about wellness strategies. So how do you balance, work in the PhD program with life? And do you have any personal wellness strategies that work well for you?
I'm still learning how to balance my work and my life. I also think that everyone else is too. I think this is a perennial problem, and I don't know if we always get on top of it, even at our worst. I think we're reminded of needing to recalibrate what that balance should look like. Let me just make sure that my mic is on too. Great. I think Joelle really hit on a lot of great points. I think imposter syndrome tends to be very real, and sometimes that can impact work-life balance because we might feel the need to work even harder and longer to try to prove to someone, and mostly just ourselves, that we're where we need to be or that we deserve where we are. And by and large, you really do deserve where you are. When I got into my program at Berkeley, people talked about imposter syndrome on the first day and pretty much remembered that they wouldn't be where they were. They wouldn't have gotten accepted if they were in fact imposters. But it's just something that, I think everyone goes through. And I don't know about you, Eric, now already being at an R1 institution, but I imagine that these are still questions that linger. For me, things that have gotten me by, and now I'm in my 6th year of my program, I really do treat this like it's a job. And so Helaine was right on the money. I try to not work more than 8 hours a day as much as possible. I try to remember that I can turn off work. I try not to work beyond 9 p.m. or even 8 p.m. And maybe because I came out of a professional career, I learned some strategies around unplugging because there's always going to be more work, always. That's also just the name of the game. And so accepting that and being okay with that is kind of half the battle. I also remember that a lot of relationships are really important, and not just the ones with my committee, meaning the people that are overseeing my actual dissertation project. This is relationships with graduate students, like what Joelle was saying, forging community, to relationships with friends and family who are not at all tied to academia and who remind me that I shouldn't become incomprehensible to most people. To administrators, again, and everyone in my department, I think needs to be valued because they do really support your career in ways that you might not anticipate. And so with all of that, I don't do any more all-nighters. I really try to kick the perfectionism as well. And I think, again, that really ties into figuring out the ways that you find meaning in other activities besides your work, right? And I think if this were a professional webinar for other folks, the same strategies would be employed and sort of the same messages would happen. And I think that can go for academics as well.
Thank you very much, Kat. For our next question, I'm going to go to Helaine. So Helaine, you had alluded to this a little bit in your talk as well, but motivations, for pursuing the PhD and then for continuing to pursue the PhD throughout the process. How did your motivations change over time, say, compared to when you first decided to pursue a PhD throughout the process?
Yeah, well, I think Eric did a great job actually touching on this as well, so I don't know if he wants to follow up or if anybody else wants to, but so I actually went to one of these, what Eric was talking about, teaching focused undergraduate, so very small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia, and I never had TAs, I only had professor, like the actual professors, and I really romanticized like their lives, that they're going to be, I'm going to be sitting in seminars for the rest of my life discussing, these lofty historical ideas, and I loved that. I loved being in a seminar and just discussing, a couple of books for 2 hours, and it was truly my passion, and history still is my passion, but when I got to grad school, I sort of fairly rapidly found out that that is not the norm. That there's a lot of administrative work involved, as Eric pointed out. Even I think even in the teaching roles, and that. And to get my PhD, right, I had to do, I wasn't just, I did a lot of seminars, the first couple of years, I loved it. And then I got to the research phase where I was like pretty much alone. And especially if you're doing something in humanities and social sciences, you're not necessarily working in a laboratory with other people. So my husband has his PhD in electrical engineering from Berkeley, and he was always with his lab group, and they were always doing their lab group things. And, in the humanities and some of the social sciences, like that's not the case, right? It's a lot of alone time. It's a lot of time in archives, a lot of time writing alone. And so I didn't really kind of bargain on that. And so I pretty much every year of my program, I would contemplate quitting. And then it just got to the point where it was like, okay, I'm this far along, let's finish. And like Eric, I'm kind of a mix between, I think, Eric and Joelle's experience. I have no regrets about getting my PhD. I think I would do it again, even though I did not go into academia. But it is a very challenging environment. And so I think for me, what it actually came down to is recognize, and I don't actually think I realized this until I transitioned out of academia. But part of getting your PhD is making that transition from student to professional in whatever field you're pursuing, and really owning that work. So I think for me, I really viewed the PhD as an extension of being an undergraduate student, getting assignments, being good at it, going into those seminars, discussing the work, but never really realizing, okay, but now I have to, really own this work and take it on myself, and and become a historian, not a student. And so I think I never quite made that transition very well while I was in graduate school for a variety of reasons. Part of it was, not having a mentor, an advisor who really kind of focused on that, really teaching me, okay, like, here's how the profession of being a historian. But in retrospect, I sort of realized that was part of my reason for leaving academia. Was never quite making that mental transition. So yeah, I think, again, and I really, the other thing too is, like, I had no idea when I started when I started my program, like, how awful the job market was. And like what Eric was talking about, like that, the type of job that he has is kind of a unicorn. And that, I think, like, I think universities are starting to actually recognize that, you know, most of the people getting PhDs are not going either into academia or into the traditional academic path. And they are starting to actually recognize that part of the PhD program has to be, you know, teaching students about other options, but it's very slow to change. So yeah, I mean, really think about, like, you know, do you want to be doing something this, you know, this for the next, again, it's going to took me 7 years, and that's pretty low. You know, you're going to be doing this for the next 7 or 8 years. You know, part of this process is becoming a professional in your field, not a student anymore. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that was sort of my experience, and I just want to echo that I went through a lot of the same imposter stuff that Joelle struggled with as well.
Thanks, Helaine. Going to Eric, got a question for you. You know, you mentioned that you felt like you won the lottery. You also mentioned that you had a lot of classmates who were brilliant who didn't get the tenure track positions. Besides it just being luck and a lottery, I mean, is there something in particular or that you feel really helped you attain the tenure track position, or, you know, certain factors that allowed you to get the position you have now?
Yeah, good question. So also I'll echo, even as the most professor-like person in the world, I mean, I'm a cishet white guy who looks like a professor. I feel imposter syndrome every day. So it's endemic, worse for some than others, but it's a real thing, and combating it is a challenge. Yeah, so in my case, in many ways, things just lined up perfectly for me. So there was a very, very specific call for a job opening. Basically, it was it was a call for my very specific subfield in a university where there were 5 people on the faculty who I knew and had worked with in the past, which is like the golden ticket. I mean, that's the best possible scenario. And so I'm a little ashamed to say, but actually my first time on the job market, I landed a dream job right out of the gate. But that's pretty rare. So there was, you know, the department was basically trying to expand into a new subfield, and so they gave a very specific call for people who make cryogenic detectors, which sounds like a crazy narrow thing. There's probably 1,000 people in the world who do it, and 100 of them are looking for jobs. So it's not that narrow, but it's a pretty specific subfield. And yeah, basically everything just lined up, and I managed to be in the right place at the right time to walk into that job. Now, I did a huge amount of kind of possibly obsessive research ahead of time, trying to figure out how to apply for jobs. And there are a number of resources I've looked at. I spent a lot of time looking at academic bloggers and their advice. Female Science Professor is awesome. She has a great blog if you want advice on careers in science. And there was a book called Tomorrow's Professor, which includes a lot of different kinds of jobs that don't apply to me, but might apply to other people. That gives a lot of really good advice about how to design a job talk. And I guess the punchline is basically you want to pose an exciting question and then tell people how you're going to answer it very quickly. So first couple of slides, you say, here's an exciting question that is troubling our field, and here's how I'm going to solve it. And then you go on to talk about all the details. And, you know, lots of other advice. You want to dress like a professor instead of a banker, or you know, a bum, I guess. As someone who's usually a bum and occasionally pretends to be a banker, that was useful. You know, sport coats, not ties, that kind of thing, or the equivalent attire. But yeah, I'm ashamed to say it really does seem to be largely a matter of luck. So our department has hired 8 people since I've been here. None of them were on my top 5 list, and all of them are great. And frankly, everyone I've met has been great. I don't think there's been a single applicant who wouldn't be a fantastic professor. And the fact that we've shortlisted 6 or 7 people every time and hired one is challenging. All of those people are awesome people, and some of them went on to get faculty jobs elsewhere. Some of them went on to a second postdoc or a third postdoc. A couple of them have left the field, and one is now working at a startup in Silicon Valley, seems totally happy. She loves her life. But you know, I can't say with any sort of assurance that there's a reason I'm in this chair and she's not. I think she's just as qualified.
Gotcha. Thanks a lot. Joelle, I've got a question for you. You had mentioned in your talk that, you know, one of the things that I think deterred you from maybe being a researcher at an R1 university, you said it felt sort of hyper individualistic. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, you know, why you felt that way.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't know that I can articulate how I was interpreting things then. Although I feel like I could give an answer now that's informed by I think that the answer that I would give now is true, but I don't know if it's what I would have said then. So let me put it that way. But I think a lot to me of the way that I interpret this hyper-individualism of academia is, you know, kind of ties to this point that Eric made of like maybe one of the best things from some perspective of being a faculty member is that you are your own boss, right? But part of the reason that that's the case in some sense is because faculty members, professors are like the way that they are judged in terms of like how you are moving from assistant to associate professor, how you get tenure, et cetera, is like you are very much judged on your own. Like there's no sense in which I think in most research intensive institutions that like you are part of a collaborative team with a bunch of other faculty members or anything like this. Like it's your research. Your research is your research, and it is sort of seen as a thing that you are driving and that is either successful or not because of you, but it's not something that is shared in any real way. You may have grad students, you may have postdocs and all of that. And so the reality is also, like Eric said, that like the amount of time that an actual professor spends doing the real research it ends up being much smaller than it seems like you would imagine that it would be, because there are all of these administrative tasks and so on. So you know, it is true that there are all of these sort of subordinate people who are working on your research, but they in some sense also don't count in terms of like who gets credit ultimately. So there's just a lot of very weird hierarchy in that way, and weird from my perspective, hierarchy, ways that credit is allocated. Even on the teaching side of thing, there's often, not always, but I think often this notion of like, you know, if I'm teaching a class, I get to somehow teach it however I want, and nobody else can have any say or input in what it is that I'm doing, which to me is very bizarre, because I'm not a university of one, right? So like, an undergraduate who is taking my class is taking it in parallel with a bunch of other classes, is going to go on to other classes in my department, is coming from other classes. So like, it is not true that the thing that I am teaching is isolated from everything else that's going on. So to me, it's a very bizarre idea to act as though my hypothetical teaching is isolated from everything else, and that the impact that I make on a set of students can be thought of as an isolated thing. But that is sort of implicit, I think, in a lot of the ways that people think about teaching in academia. So this is just a lot of stuff that really made no sense to me. And so when I would think about now the idea of going into a faculty position, it just doesn't appeal to me at all, because I don't want to be in an environment where where the people who are in my department are not people who I'm actually working with in any meaningful way, or a way that feels meaningful to me. So hopefully that actually answered the question.
Thank you. I have a question, and I guess anyone can answer this. A lot of our scholars who might watch this, are probably in their undergrad years, and it might be years before they enter a PhD program, or even longer before they exit one if they do decide to matriculate. And I'm just wondering if any of you have any thoughts as to how PhD programs are changing or might change in the next 5 to 10 years. And the same goes for employer demand for PhDs over the next 5 to 10 years.
So our department has been trying very hard to recognize that most people with PhDs don't become academics. And there's been a big move to make sure people are both aware and prepared for what we somewhat insultingly call industry jobs, where the industry is everything except a university. Mm-hmm. In any other field, if you referred to the entire world as industry, people would laugh at you. But so that in our case, most of our students are either aligned with engineering, so they either have lots of hardware skills or kind of clean room fabrication experience or instrument building, or they're involved in data science and they're working on large data sets and figuring out how to model trends and extract information from large amounts of data. So there's been a move to try to prepare people for those kinds of jobs. I'm not sure we're very good at it. Frankly, those of us on the faculty don't actually know anything about those jobs. So we're the worst possible people to advise anyone. But there's been a move to bring in speakers and to try to encourage people to explore those options. So I think if you're starting a PhD program, figuring out what skills will be both useful for the thing you're studying and also have other uses is a good idea. But I don't know what people in other fields would say about that.
I've seen a similar, is it okay if I jump in? A similar trend in the history field. This is much more towards the end of my PhD experience at Berkeley, but towards the end I started seeing, an annual symposium on transitioning out of academia, and I saw my department trying to actually track where people ended up if they didn't end up in academia, and being able to share that with other people. So I think a similar trend is happening, at least in the history field. I imagine in many other humanities fields as well, recognizing that this is the reality of the vast majority of people who are getting PhDs in this program. So we need to do something to prepare these people. One thing I just wanted to touch on though that Eric quickly said, you said this industry word, and that's something when you decide to transition out of academia, it's definitely something that I did struggle with, the sense of oh, if I get any other job that's outside of a university, I'm somehow a failure, or it's less than, You know, I just couldn't intellectually cut it. And you know, and several years down the road, 6 years down the road, I still once in a while like entertain that idea, but it's ridiculous. You know, and I'd like to think that mentality is changing, but I think it's pretty slow to change that. You know, if you decide to prove something outside that, like, you know, I don't know, you've left the fold. It's like, it's almost like leaving a religion or something. I don't know. But it's just another thing to kind of struggle with as if you decide to not become a professor.
I mean, that academia was originally populated by clerics wearing robes. Is not...
Yes, fair. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it does emerge from the church, basically.
Yeah. No, it's.
I will say for the humanities, and I'm in a humanities department, there's always been this crisis in the humanities.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's nothing new. And that's to also say that there are a lot of trends that come and go throughout academia and definitely through the humanities. Funding, for instance, always seems to be a problem, and we're always getting absorbed by STEM, you know, and bled dry. But I don't, you know.
Sorry.
Right? What I have heard now, though, is that there are departments across the United States, or at least maybe on the East Coast, where capstone projects or dissertations are not looking like the normal sort of 150, 250 word dissertation, or normal, rather the expected dissertation, but are looking very different. They're looking like community integration projects. They're looking like other sort of capstone projects that don't mimic what we kind of see as the dissertation. And this is just ways to change the humanities, I think, at some institutions. And even if this crisis is still going on, you know, there are ways that the humanities is sort of adapting. I know Eric mentioned data science, so the digital humanities is very big right now.
Yes.
Very, very big.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, tapping into ways that your project can be interdisciplinary, for instance, even with STEM fields, right? If you're in a languages department or even a history department, these are also kind of the in thing. But, you know, I would caution against following trends. I really would. And recognizing that at the end of the day, it's the project that you want to stick with for 6 to 10 years that's really going to get you through. Because if you're not passionate about the trend, you're probably not going to want to complete your project.
And ed tech is another big, and that's actually kind of what I consider myself to be in, is another, I think, big field. So digital humanities is kind of part of that.
Ed tech being short for educational technology.
Yes, sorry.
And one other piece, sort of connecting to this business of maybe there's a trend towards some departments, you know, trying to support the professionalization of their students so that, you know, they actually have a whole bunch of skills that are helpful both within and outside of academia. My guess is that lots more departments are doing that. If yours isn't, like if you are a current grad student or whatever, that doesn't mean all hope is lost, because you can do that sort of stuff for yourself, right? It just takes work and effort. But like back towards the end of my time at Berkeley, there were 2 or 3 grad students who started a whole professional development program for the grad students. I think that they talked to one of the graduate student administrative people in the front office, who, by the way, side note, you should make those people your best friends. Like, you know, give them chocolate when they do nice things for you, like whatever. But like, actually the administrators in the front office are super, super, super important, because they're the ones who are going to make things happen, like, and cut through logistical and administrative bullshit when you need them to, if they like you. If you're an asshole to them, they won't. So besides the fact that you should just be a good person, that is also motivation for being nice to those folks. All right. End side note. So these folks, they went to that person. They got a whole list of like, who are all the graduates, people who have graduated. They went track them all down on LinkedIn, and they just started inviting them to campus to give monthly talks on like, what their trajectories were. Right. So, you know, there are ways to go and create the things that don't exist if you need them to exist. You know, and that'll look good on your resume. And you would have helped your fellow students. So, you know, that is a sort of proactivity that I would also encourage.
Great. Well, I think we're at an hour now, so I think we're going to wrap this up. And unless anyone else has anything else they want to ask or add.
I have one plug that I want to make. So Eric gave a few references to some resources. One that I want to plug is The Professor is In, which is a website, theprofessorisin.com. It's run by Karen Kelsky, who is a former professor and department chair. She's great. And essentially her website, well, now really a whole business, she employs all sorts of people, is really all about supporting people through the process of being a grad student and exiting grad school, you know, in a productive way, whether that means going on to a tenure track position or leaving academia or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that her website is a great starting point for all sorts of questions about academia.
I have another couple of resources that are also, I think, good that I used. There's one called the Versatile Ph.D., and they have job listings for you know, sort of careers that would be suitable for someone with a PhD. They also have local groups that you can get together with, so you can meet other people, other PhDs who are, you know, seeking to leave academia. I went to a couple of their meetings when I was in that process. And then another one, I've actually never used it, but I met them at a conference. They're called Beyond the Professoriate, and I think they do like a similar type thing. I think they're actually in Denver, or I don't know. Anyway, yeah, those are two places I would also recommend.
On this tip, I would also recommend the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. This organization tends to support folks in their writing process with every step of the application process into the postdoc or the tenure track fields. And it also tends to prioritize folks who are underrepresented in higher education, especially in tenure track positions. And so they provide really nice trainings for how to stay on top of your writing, which is really important for, I think, all of our fields to an extent. And even ways to, I think, you know, land the tenure track job, especially when you are up against the hurdles of being an underrepresented person in your discipline. So again, that's the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity.
Fantastic.
And just so you all know, I'm in Asian studies and I am very underrepresented in my discipline.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want to remind us of yours, Eric, just for convenience?
Oh, yeah, trying to remember what I pitched. I think it was, there's a blogger named Female Science Professor that does a really nice, well, for the last 12 years or so has done a really nice job of providing a balanced view of academic life, I guess. The other was a book called Tomorrow's Professor, which I recommend with caveats, but is worth a look.
Thank you very much to all of you once again. Really appreciate the four of you, taking the time on your Sunday to speak with us and participate in this webinar. To any of the scholars who may watch the recorded version of this, feel free to follow up with any of our panelists if you have any questions, or if you prefer, you can send them to me. I'm happy to put you in touch with them. But if you log into our scholars website, you will be able to find everyone's contact information there. And just thank you again for everyone who participated and for everyone who's watching this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Bye.